Welcome to Wednesday night Bible study. We just got done with prayer. I'm glad everybody online is here with us. We're in Daniel. We're in chapter 11. This chapter is long and it's very busy, so I don't know how many weeks it's going to take us to get through it. But we're going to start and we'll see how far we get. How's that sound? So Daniel chapter 11. And the first verse says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him." That verse actually goes with, I think I said this last week, it goes on the end of chapter 10, because this angel that was talking to Daniel kind of continued in there when he was talking about how he was going to leave, and Michael was there to help him, and he was going back to fight the prince of Greece, or to deal with him. And then he goes on to say, in the first year that Darius the Mede, I arose to encourage and protect him. But Daniel's not actually getting this vision in the first year of Darius. It's actually in about 3 years later. Remember last week we talked about Daniel was praying for 3 weeks in chapter 10. And when the angel finally came to talk to him, he said, for 3 weeks I was going to bring you the answer to your prayer, but I kind of got detained with the prince of Persia. And it could literally be the prince of Persia that the battle was going over his mind, because remember, Cyrus let the Jewish people go back to their homeland to start rebuilding the temple, but the work had stopped. They got the foundation laid, but it stopped because of controversy from the neighbors and the Samaritans, and they said, you're trying to rebel against the Persian kingdom, and so it all come to a screeching halt. And Daniel started praying and said, what's going on, God? I thought you said 70 years and they've gone back, but now your temple's not getting rebuilt. And so he started this prayer. And God gives him an answer and said, listen, they did go back, but I'm going to deal with your people for many, many years after this. And that was in chapter 9. He gives that kind of vision there. But now God is going to start laying out details of the future to Daniel. Things that were going to happen in the near future and the far future. And we're probably not going to get into the far future, the Antichrist and all that this week, because there's so much for us to cover. But let's just start. In verse 2 of chapter 11, the angel's talking to Daniel, and this is what he says to him. He says, now I will tell you the truth. Behold, there are going to be 3 more kings that are going to rise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them, and soon will become strong though through his riches, and he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. So let's stop right there. We got through one whole verse, didn't we? So this angel's talking to Daniel while Daniel's praying, and remember, he's out by the river, and he was praying again with some other people, and the other people that are there with him, they don't get to hear this angel talk. They get to hear a noise, but they ran and hid. Remember, they heard, like Charlie Brown's teacher on the cartoon, they just heard a noise and they got freaked out and they ran. And so here's Daniel, and we talked last week in chapter 10 how he fainted, he fell on his face. Angel told him stand back up, and he says, now this is what's going to happen. So he starts to lay out this prophecy of future events. The things we're going to cover this week are in our past, but they're in Daniel's future. Okay? And you're going to be amazed at how well it's laid out and how it happens so well. He says to him in verse 2, he says there's going to be 3 more kings, and then the fourth is going to rise with power. And so the kings that come after, in verse 2, that come after Cyrus, and remember, Cyrus and Darius were ruling co-regent. All right, so sometimes you see Cyrus, sometimes you see Darius. They're ruling co-regent because it's a Medo-Persian Empire at this time. This is 3 years after Darius and 3 years after Cyrus and 3 years after they've gone back to start rebuilding the temple. But the next king to come is Cambyses, and he ruled from 530 to 522. So remember, we're talking that this vision is taking place in 536. So 6 years after this angel is talking to Daniel, another king rises to power, which is the son of Cyrus, and his name is Cambyses. And he rules from 530 to 522, which is only 8 years. Then the next king that rises is Pseudo-Smyrtus. He only reigns for a few months. He's not really supposed to rule. He kind of snuck his way in there. He didn't last very long. And then Darius the First. Another thing you'll find out when we're studying Daniel chapter 11 is a lot of people have the same name. Darius the First, Darius the Second, Smyrtus the First. We go from Ptolemy. When we get to the generals, we go from Ptolemy 1 to Ptolemy 8. They just keep calling their kids the same name. Talk about confusing when you're trying to look at history. But the angel doesn't really give Daniel names. He just says kings will arise, and these are who the kings are going to be. So Darius the First rises to power in 522 after this Smyrtus dies. He's only reigns for a few months. But Darius reigns until 486, so he has a pretty long run. And and this is not even the Darius that threw Daniel in the lion's den. The Darius that threw Daniel in the lion's den ruled before Daniel even sees this vision. This is 3 years after Daniel, or 2.5 years after Daniel was in the lion's den, that he's even getting to talk to this angel. All right? So am I already confusing you? The Darius that threw him in the lion's den is actually still ruling when he's getting this vision, and Cambius is going to rise 6 years later. Okay? So after Darius the First dies in 486, a guy named Xerxes rises to power. And that's the fourth king that he talks about at the end there, where it says this king with all of his riches and is going to be stronger than the other three, is going to rouse the Greece Empire. Xerxes, have you heard the word Xerxes before? We studied last year or the year before. Time flies by. It took us almost a year to get through Ezekiel, didn't it? We studied a little book called Esther. Remember studying the book of Esther? Who was the king when Esther became queen? Xerxes, called Ahasuerus also. Both had this, that was the same guy, two different names. So Xerxes, so this is the same guy. So Xerxes comes to power in 486, and the book of Esther happens during the reign of Xerxes. And in fact, in chapter 1 and 2, between chapters 1 and 2 is when Esther comes to power, and then Xerxes goes off to fight the Greek Empire. And he goes to fight the Greek Empire. Anybody ever watch a movie called The 300, the Spartans? That's this war. That's when Xerxes goes to fight him at that time. He goes to Greece to fight against Athens, and the Spartans, I'm going sideways. We're not even going to get as far as I thought. But the Athens and Spartans, they weren't really, Greek wasn't a nation. It was a bunch of small city-states. So the Athens and the Spartans weren't really part of the same. They were both Greek, but they would say, no, I'm not Greek, I'm Athens. I'm not Greek, I'm a Spartan. But they were all Greek. And so they weren't really one huge nation. They were a bunch of small ones. But when this Persian king Xerxes come to attack Athens, the Spartans said, we're going to help. And so they did help. In fact, they said, we're going to hold him off. We know where he's coming down this road, and it gets real skinny, and he's either got to go in the ocean or climb a cliff. We're going to stop him right there, and we'll hold him off until you guys get ready in Athens, and he's coming. And they did. That whole movie called The 300, that 300 held off, in fact, over 200,000 in the army coming with this Persian king Xerxes. They held off 200,000. Why? Because if you're in a narrow strait, you can't get everybody to the front line. And so these 300 held them off and held them off and held them off and held them off. And all the time, the Athens, the other Greeks, are getting their ducks in a row. And then when they finally do get defeated, the Greeks defeat this army of Xerxes, and Xerxes goes home with his tail between his legs. And when he gets home, that's when they say, well, maybe we ought to get you a new queen, because he had gotten rid of Vashti before he left, so we'll get you a new queen. And they got Esther for him, okay? So this is the same guy. And he rules from 486 to 465. And when he went and stirred up the Greeks, now that was in 480s, about 480 is when he stirred up the Greeks. They never forgot that. They never forgot that the Persian Empire came down there and tried to take them over. And so for the next 100 and some years, in fact, a guy rose to power. In fact, let's read the next verse. In verse 3 of Daniel chapter 11, it says, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases." I want you to know that between verse 2 and verse 3, over 100 years just went by in Daniel chapter 11. It did. And so when we're reading it, we're thinking, well, these kings, chapter 2, hundreds of years went by there. We went from 539 to 465 just in chapter 2. Then from 465, we go all the way to 334. And 334 is when Alexander the Great, he's from Greece, rises to power, and that's verse 3. So you see how many years we just went? So when we're going through here, you got to realize we're going to be talking about the king of the north and the king of the south. And just because it says it's not the same king every time. It's going to go from generation to generation to generation, and hundreds of years are going to go by until we get all the way to 168. In fact, all the way to Rome in the 60s BC. Is going to be in this chapter. In fact, by the time we get to the end of Daniel chapter 11, we're all the way to our future, the Antichrist, the end of the world. All right? The 7-year tribulation period. So this chapter, this angel gives Daniel this vision and explains this vision to him the best he can, and Daniel writes it down the best he can understand it for us, of the entire rest of history from his time, starting right there in Persia, all the way to the end. So Alexander the Great rises to power, and he is born in 356. He rises to power in about 336, so he's only about 20 years old. And he says, we're going to go defeat those Persians, those bad Persians that came over here and tried to take us over. And by the way, they never did take them over. All right, the Persians never did take over the Greeks. But then he backs up. Well, let me go forward. It says, but as soon as he has risen, and we studied this in Ezekiel too, but as soon as he has risen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. So when Alexander's empire rises to power, in 336, he starts his campaign to take over the world. He had no idea it was going to go that far, but it was going so good. In 11 years, he had conquered the whole known world. Everything. The people in Israel, Judah, they loved him because when he got there and he was going to come in and take them over, they wouldn't let him in the city. And the priest came out and said, let me show you Isaiah, where it talks about this king that's going to come. And he read Jeremiah and Isaiah, and he said, wow, that's me. All right, you guys can stay here. And he just bypassed them, okay? And so they kind of liked Alexander, but by the time Alexander was 33 years old, in 323, he had conquered the whole known world. His army kind of rebelled against him and said, we're not going any farther. He got all the way to India, and he said, there's people in India, let's go. And they said, we're not going. We haven't been home in years. We're not even sure that our homeland is still there. We want to go home. So he said, all right, we'll go home. He starts on his way home. They get back to Babylon, and he says, let's build a fleet of ships, and we're going to sail home. They said, sounds good to us. So they start building this fleet of ships so they can sail home. Alexander the Great dies in the palace in Babylon, that same room where the handwriting on the wall came to Belshazzar. Remember that in history? Where when the kingdom of Babylon fell to the Persians, Belshazzar was in there having a drunken orgy with all of his noblemen, and he was using the goblets out of the temple in Israel, and a hand showed up on the wall and said, your days are numbered. You've been weighed in the balance, and your days are numbered. And they called Daniel to come in, and Daniel said, today you're going to die. And sure enough, the Persians had stopped up the river, came in, and remember that story? I think I lost you. I'll keep moving forward. He dies, Alexander the Great dies in that room, that same room. And when he was dying, his generals all came in and said, who's going to be in charge now? And all Alexander said was, the strongest. Well, what do you think that did? That started a war. Because they're all, I'm the strongest. No, I'm the strongest. No, I'm the strongest. So all these generals went and they got their men and said, come on. And they split up and they started to fight over this kingdom. So for the next 15 years, there's this battle going on over these generals, over who's going to be the king of this Greek empire. And it ended up being split into 4 ways. Now, there were more than 4 generals, but it got whittled down to four sections, okay? And that's why it says, as soon as he's risen, his kingdom will be broken up. So Alexander the Great didn't rule for very long, 11 years, that's it. He died in 323, and his empire is broken up, and it says toward the 4 points of the compass. And that's exactly what happened. 4 generals ended up coming out on top. See how exacting this prophecy that the angel has given Daniel is laying out in history. Now remember, Daniel is living in the 500s. This is 536 when he's getting this. We're all the way to 323 already. 323, and we're only in verse 4, and it's happening just exactly the way the angel told him it was going to happen. So he says his nation, Alexander's nation, can be split up to the 4 points of the compass, although not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Alexander the Great actually had 2 sons. One was legitimate, one was illegitimate. They both were killed. Why do you think they did that? The generals didn't want them competing for power, okay? In fact, as I was reading, his illegitimate son, he called Hercules. It's not that Hercules, all right? But he did call him Hercules, started the Greek gods and how all that rise went. But his kids were killed, so it didn't go to his descendants, which is exactly what the angel told Daniel in chapter 4. It's going to get split up, and his descendants aren't going to get any of it. In fact, within 15 years, by 308, none of Alexander the Great's family was still alive. They'd all been killed. All of them. And none of the generals ever got Greece back to the same power that Alexander had, because that's what it says. Never with the authority that he had in verse 4. So we're at verse 5 now. It says, then the king of the south will grow strong. Now let me tell you about the 4 generals, and then we'll get into the king of the south and the king of the north. The 4 generals that rose to power that were part of Alexander the Great's kingdom was Seleucus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus. All right, those are the 4 that rose to the top. There were still some other generals still around that kind of kept their head down and stayed out of trouble and maybe had this little section or were serving under some of these guys. But these 4 rose to power, and they took over they chopped it up into 4 parts. Well, Cassander and Lysimachus, they went toward Rome and Europe and took over that part. In fact, I got down here, Lysimachus took Asia, which is Turkey and Asia there, and Cassander went back toward Greece and Macedonia. But Seleucus took the north, like Assyria, the northern part of Israel and all of Babylon and the Assyrian Empire, all of that. And Ptolemy went south and took over Egypt, the southern half of Israel and Egypt. The next few verses, in fact, I think from verse 5 through 15, these guys are going to be fighting over who's going to get this territory. They fight each other over, I'm taking you over, no you're not, I'm taking you over, no you're not, I'm taking you over, back and forth and back and forth. And it's not even the same kings. We're going to cover a couple hundred years where this guy's son says, okay, my dad couldn't do it, I'm going to do it. And he goes and attacks, and this guy fights back, and it's going to go generation to generation. Well, they're going back and forth. Guess who's right in the middle of these 2, the north and the south? Israel. God's chosen people. So we don't hear anything about Cassander and Lysimachus because they're not even messing with God's people. And this vision that Daniel's getting is about Israel. It's about God's people. And so the king of the north, which is Seleucus, his kingdom, they run over Israel and they go toward Egypt, and then Egypt, Ptolemy, he comes back and he runs over Israel. And so they're fighting in Israel back and forth. So Israel's in the middle of a battlefield for the next couple hundred years, okay? And they have to decide, if you were a Jew living at that time, you had to decide who's going to win this one. Because I want to be on that guy's side. Does that make sense? I don't want to pick sides and it be the wrong side. So for a couple hundred years, each generation had to decide, okay, we're in the middle of another war here. Who's going to win? Should we help this guy or should we help that guy? And sometimes you didn't have a choice. They'd come in and say, whose side are you on? And you had to pick. You had to choose or go underground. And so that's why the next few verses are going to cover like that. So let's go forward. It says, the king of the south, which is Ptolemy in Egypt, and part of Israel, will grow strong along with one of his princes. In fact, one of his princes turns out to be this Seleucus, which is up north. The Seleucus governor used to be a sergeant underneath of Ptolemy. But he had been graduated to a general, and when things started coming apart, he said, I'm getting a piece of the pie myself. So he is up north, and he's getting attacked from one of these generals from the west coming across the top. So Ptolemy comes up and helps him, and when it's all over, Seleucus is stronger even than Ptolemy is. He has more territory, and he's stronger. So this verse is talking about that. It says, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be of great dominion indeed. So that little battle, Ptolemy going to helped him get stronger. And it says, after some years, you know what it means by after some years? The next generation. We just skipped 50 years, okay? In fact, verse 6, we move now to different kings. Ptolemy II is in Egypt, and we're talking the years 283 to 246. So now we're not even in the years 300 anymore. We just jumped from the time Alexander the Great died in 323. Now we're going to get all the way to 246. So see how almost 100 years has gone by in just a couple verses. All right, so the next generation. I also would like to throw something else in here. During the years, in verse 5, when that battle was going on, Ptolemy said, I want to be in charge of Egypt. And the Egyptians said, if you're going to be Pharaoh, you have to bury the last Pharaoh. And if you bury the last Pharaoh, that's a sign to us that you're the one that's supposed to be in charge. So he got a hold of Alexander the Great's body, took it to Egypt, and buried it in a city called Alexandria. And as soon as he did that, all of Egypt said, you're the next guy in charge. So that's how he kind of got in charge of Egypt. That, and he had a Greek army, part of a Greek army with him that helped him out in that area. But Ptolemy II, after he died, another Ptolemy II took over. And all these Ptolemies have different names after them. It's like Ptolemy Alexander or Ptolemy something else. You know, they always have this other middle name in there. It's like, I heard one guy say this week, all the Spanish people say their daughters are all Maria. Maria da-da-da-da or Maria da-da-da-da. This is the same thing going on here. They just keep naming their kids the same name, okay? But I'm just going to say Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third, because as generations go by, that's exactly what they do. During the years 283 to 246, Ptolemy II actually is the one that said, I want the Old Testament translated into Greek. He's the one that started the Septuagint getting written. In fact, by the time he dies in 246, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are already translated into Greek, okay? That's important, and the reason I said that is, you don't know how many people will read Daniel chapter 11 and say, there's no way that Daniel wrote that. It's too accurate, it's too precise in history. There's no way he knew that before it happened, and it is so exacting, they say Daniel cannot be inspired. Daniel was written in later on. Well, you know what? By the year 160, all the Old Testament, even the book of Daniel was written into Greek, and some of the stuff hadn't even happened by then. So they can argue all they want. In fact, even Jesus, what did Jesus say in Matthew? He said, according to Daniel, what Daniel said, that the abomination of desolation is going to be in the temple. So even Jesus gives credibility to the book of Daniel. So there's a lot of people out there that say there's no way Daniel was written by Daniel. And it was written by Daniel, and he lived in the 500s, okay? So 500 years before Jesus, he started writing history down that was going to happen right up until Jesus and even farther than that. There's a whole lot more in here, and I'm going to keep going, though. One of those small generals, not one of the 4, his name was Antiguus. He attacked Seleucus in 515. That's why this Ptolemy the first went to help him. And Ptolemy the first named his daughter Cleopatra the seventh, or Cleopatra the first. She's the first of 7 Cleopatras that are coming over this history right here. All right? In fact, the Cleopatra that we know about, that you watch all the movies about, that Cleopatra actually comes during Roman period. But there is a Cleopatra that's going to be used as a pawn, even in this history, if I get that far today. So, I'm in verse 6, right? After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out peaceful arrangement. That's the Cleopatra. No, it isn't. That is not Cleopatra. That's coming later. I'm going to keep reading the verse and then I'll go back. Because this is, you know what? This stuff I'm about to tell you, in fact, this whole chapter 11, it's better than Dallas or General Hospital or any daytime soap opera. This stuff is unreal. I mean, it's just crazy, all the stuff that they did. They started sending their daughters to get married to this person, to form an alliance and trick these people. And it was just backstabbing and trickery. And it was just crazy, all the stuff that went on. But in verse 6 it says, the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with all those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, that's her dad, and as well as the one who supported her in these times, which would be her new husband. So let me tell you, it's Ptolemy the second. So we got totally different kings. This king of the north ain't even the king of the north, and the king of the south ain't the same king of the south. But Ptolemy the second sends his daughter. Her name is Bernice. It's pronounced Berenice, but it's easier just to say Bernice. He arranges to have his daughter. He said, listen, if we're going to have an alliance, you got to marry my daughter. Well, the problem is the king that was in the north wasn't Seleucus anymore. It was Antiochus the second. And Antiochus the second was already married. So in order for him to marry this Bernice, he had to divorce his first wife. Her name was Laodice or Laodicea. She was named after a city, or the city was named after her. He had to divorce her. Well, she already had a son, a small son. Well, he did divorce her because he wanted to have peace. In fact, he thought, if I marry her, I can kind of annex Egypt and make my kingdom bigger. All these people are always conniving and always stirring, trying to get things. So he divorces his first wife, marries this Bernice. She's there just a few years. She has a son, an infant son. And this Laodicea poisons Bernice, kills her son, has all the entourage that she came with, because she came with this whole entourage from Egypt up there, has all of them killed. In fact, she didn't do that until Ptolemy II died. When Ptolemy II of Egypt died, she said, now's my chance. And she did. This is when she does it. Then she tells her husband, you need to marry me. So he remarries her again. This Antiochus II remarries her again. Then she poisons him. Now her son, who's just young, rises to be king. And his name is, she named him Seleucus II. He becomes king, okay? Some years go by. In fact, let me see if I'm supposed to be reading anymore. I am. Verse 7. Now we're all the way to verse 7, and another 25, 30, 40 years has gone by. Time's flying by as we're reading. Verse 7. But one of the descendants of the line her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. In fact, it's a totally different king. Remember, now it's her son, Seleucus II. And he will deal with them and display great strength. Also their gods and their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he and his part will refrain from attacking the kingdom of the north for some years. Her brother, this Bernice's brother, says, I'm going to take revenge on this Assyrian empire up there, this king of the north. And so he goes and he marches against him, this Seleucus II, which is this Laodicea's son. And he goes in there and attacks him, and he does. He wins. He takes revenge. He actually hauls 2,500 of their gold idols back to Egypt. And about 2,000 talents of silver with him. Takes a whole bunch of booty back to Egypt. All right? Then you read at the end of this, says, then he left them alone for some years. Some more years are going by. Now we're at 240 BC when he takes this revenge. This Seleucus II doesn't last very long. In fact, he dies, and then Seleucus III comes to power. Let's go on and read verse 9. It says, "Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, and he will return to his own land." Seleucus III goes down to Egypt and says, "I'm going to go back and get all that booty back." He goes down there and he loses horribly and has to go back home. That's what verse 9 is talking about. But it's not even the same Seleucus that lost the booty. Seleucus II's died. There's a whole new king, it's Seleucus III. And when I keep saying second and third, they got middle names that are different, but I can't remember them and I didn't write them down, and you'll never remember anyway. I just want you to know that generations are going by all through this chapter. Time is going by, okay? So this Seleucus III goes back home. He's been whipped. He doesn't live very long. In fact, he only reigns for about 4 years, and he's killed by conspiracy, not in battle. He dies while he's at home. Then another king rises to power in the north. His name is Antiochus the Great, and he reigns for 36 years. He reigns a long time. Okay, so he reigns for 36 years, and he's going to be battling against a guy named Ptolemy IV. So now Ptolemy III has died. We got Ptolemy IV. Generations are going by. As I'm reading this and studying it, I'm like, wow, this angel is packing all this stuff in, and Daniel's trying to write all this stuff down. Do you think when Daniel was writing it down, he thought it's the same kings? They keep battling. Well, you'd think these two guys would listen. Well, it ain't the same two guys. It's the descendants of these two guys. They keep saying, well, he beat my dad. I'm going and giving him a whooping. And then after he gets whooped, he says, well, he comes, so he whooped my dad. Now I'm going to go give him a whooping. Well, it's different generations going back and forth. What I want you to remember is the king of Egypt goes to the north and fights, and then they go to the south. Every time the king of Egypt wins, Israel and Jerusalem is under Egyptian control. Then when this king comes back and beats this guy, now it's under Assyrian control. Then when this guy wins, it's under Egyptian control. So Jerusalem's like, now we're Egyptian, now we're Assyrian, now we're Egyptian, now we're Assyrian, back and forth. And the battles are going on in Israel. That's why God is kind of laying this out to Daniel, is because, Daniel, your people are going to be in the middle of this whole sordid soap opera, back and forth. For hundreds of years, you're going to be right smack dab in the middle of it. You know what? By the time this is all over, and I'm kind of skipping ahead, I'll come back, the Jewish people are ready for the Messiah to come. They're like, God, when is this going to be over? We want the Messiah. Someone's got to come and deliver us from this mess, because we don't know who's strongest. We keep taking a guess. Well, it looks like Antiochus is going to be the strongest. It looks like Ptolemy's going to be the strongest. And if they choose wrong, they die. And so the people that chose right or kept their head down, they're still there waiting for the next battle. And maybe they'll die and their kids will have to face the next battle, which is what happened a lot. So I think I'm in verse 10. It says, now his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, and he may again wage war up to his very fortress. And the king of the south will engage and go forth. So when Seleucus III dies, another king comes to power named Antiochus the Great. And Antiochus the Great says, I'm going to mobilize this big force. I'm going down to Egypt, and I'm going to teach him a lesson. And so he has to, at first, in my mind, when I was studying, I'm thinking, okay, they go through Israel to Egypt to fight. No, they don't. They go to Israel to fight, because remember, Egypt owns Israel. So the battle don't start in Egypt. The battle starts in Israel. And they start fighting all the way through Israel. And so Israel is destroyed every time. It's just destroyed. City after city is destroyed as they fight their way back to Egypt. And then when Egypt comes back, they have to start fighting right there at the Israel, and they start fighting their way back north. So when it says the king of the north is fighting the south, they're fighting right in Israel. Okay? But when Antiochus comes, they call him Antiochus the Great. He served for 36 years. In verse 11, he comes down, Ptolemy IV. We're all the way to Ptolemy IV. We're 4 generations in now. He wins. He defeats them and turns them around and heads them back. And when Antiochus the Great is turned around to head back, he is angry. He's upset. Well, he has to turn around and head back. He's actually given back some of this land that he went to Egypt he had to fight his way in. He's mad. What do you call that when somebody has a bad day at work and when they get home they kick the cat? Well, that's about the same thing that's happened. He lost there, so on the way home he's going to kick the cat. Well, Israel's the cat. And that happened a lot. Either when the guy was heading back south or heading back north, they kicked the cat, and Israel was the cat. So Israel always got the brunt of the bad attitude, or, I had a bad day at the war today, so I'm going to take it out on you. You're on my way home. So the king of the south will engage him, go forth. I read that. Ptolemy the fourth wins. Verse 12, it says, when the multitude is carried away in his heart, he will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. That was talking about Antiochus the Great. All right, and then verse 13, he lost that battle. He caused tens of thousands to fall, but he did not win. Ptolemy the fourth turned him around and headed him back north. It says, for the king of the north will again raise a great multitude. Then the former, which is Ptolemy, and after the interval of some years, and now again, time's gone by. Now it's 201 BC. So we went from 240 to 201. So 40 years has passed. A former interval of years have passed. He will press on with another great army with much equipment, and now he's going to come and attack Egypt again, and there's another guy in charge named Ptolemy the fifth. All right, so a whole nother generation. 40 years has gone by, and he's going to come attack, and it says he's going to rise up against the king of the south, and violent ones among the people will also lift themselves up. That violent ones among your people, this angel's talking to Daniel, some Jewish people started to revolt at that time. They're like, we don't like being under the rule of Assyria or under the rule of Egypt. So they started a revolution, a revolt against them. And so they said, if we're going to be in the middle of the war, we might as well fight like we're going to take our own land back. So that's what that talked about right there, the Jewish revolt. It says, themselves in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. In other words, it didn't go anywhere. And it didn't go anywhere under Ptolemy the fifth and this Antiochus the Great. They didn't win. In fact, they were persecuted more and more. In verse 15, it says, the king of the north will cast up a siege ramp and capture well-fortified cities and forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for they will be no strength. They will have no strength to stand. So now Jerusalem again is Assyrian. They're not Egyptian. Now they're Assyrian again. In verse 15. Let me see if I got a date wrote down. Verse 15, that's somewhere around the 201, like I told you. He loses to Antiochus the Great. In fact, he had help. As I was reading that, Philip V, which is a whole other king from Macedonia, one of these other kings up here where Greece was, came to help him win that, okay? Verse 17, is that where we're at? Verse 16. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land and with destruction in his hand. So this Antiochus the Great stayed in Israel for a while and made everybody, in fact, as I read some of this, he made the Israelites try to be Greek. They're trying to make them Greek instead of Jewish. They're trying to change their customs. They're trying to change the language. They're trying to change a whole bunch of stuff. Gods, everything. They're trying to make them Greek. Verse 17, it says, he will set his face to come with power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, and he will not make a stand for him or be on his side. Let me stop right there. Antiochus the Great actually wants to make peace with Egypt, and he knows he won that war, he won that battle, but he wants it to last. And so this Ptolemy the fifth, Ptolemy the fifth loses the battle, but he loses because he's just a kid. His dad has died and he's just a kid. He's now 14 years old. He's 14 years old. And Antiochus didn't kill him. He said, I want you to marry my daughter, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was 17 years old. And his idea was, if I can get my 17-year-old daughter to marry this 14-year-old king of Egypt, said she'll be able to wag the dog, she'll be like my satellite country, and my empire will be as big as I want it to be anyway, because my daughter's down there kind of schmoozing with the king of Egypt, and everything will go just like it's supposed to go. And he had the power to do it at that point, so he sent his daughter, and they got married. The only problem was his daughter betrayed him. She fell in love with Ptolemy V, and she said, you know what, my dad's kind of ruthless. I heard there's this little upstart nation starting called Rome. We should call them and see if they'll help us get our independence. So Cleopatra actually betrayed her own dad. And Rome wasn't very big at that point, but they were strong where they were. In fact, they'd been watching all this stuff go on over there, and they were probably getting big enough to, with help from somebody, if they could ally with somebody, they'd be strong enough to do whatever they needed to do. There's no way either one of these people could win against Rome and the other side. So Cleopatra falls in love with Ptolemy, and they appeal to Rome, and Antiochus the Great gets mad. In fact, he says, I'm going to show my daughter that Rome is not as big as she thinks they are. So he makes a trek right across Greece, right across the top, all the way over there, and he's going to defeat Rome. He's going to give them a whooping. Well, the problem is he gets to Greece, and Rome kind of allies with these other generals that are up there. And when he gets there, he gets his rear end whooped. He doesn't do very good. In fact, this happens twice to him because the Roman general up there, this is in 188 BC. Now we're all the way to 188. The Roman general, his name is Scipio. He says, you got one choice. You can retreat and get out of here, just surrender this whole battle and leave, or you're going to have to take the whole brunt of all of Rome. And he says, okay, I'm leaving. And he turns around and he leaves. All right? So he didn't show his daughter that Rome wasn't all they were supposed to be. Rome was actually stronger than he thought. So he goes back home, and he has to pay a tax now to Rome. When he surrendered, in fact, I'll tell you a story. This happened twice to him. That general drew a circle around him and said, you have to surrender or you're going to die. And he said, well, can you give me some time to think about it? And he said, sure, no problem. He took his sword and he drew a circle all the way around this Antiochus the Great. And he said, as long as you give me your answer before you leave that circle. Because if you leave that circle without giving me an answer, you're going to die. So what choice did he have? I mean, it was full surrender. So he had to pay 1,000 talents of silver per year to Rome after that. 1,000 talents of silver to Rome. 1,000 talents is, a talent of silver is 100 pounds. No. Yeah, 100 pounds. So what's 1,000 times 100? Huh? 100,000. 100,000 talents of silver, 100,000 pounds of silver per year. So you know what he had to do? He had to start taking big taxes from his people to get enough money to pay off the protection, to keep Rome from coming over there and taking it. And so people didn't like him, and he ended up being killed in 187. So a year after he made that big mistake, he ends up dying. And then his successor takes over, which is his son, Seleucus IV, and he has to keep up this taxation, and he doesn't last very long because his treasurer guy, his name is Helodorus. Let me see if I can say it right. Helodorus. He sends him to Jerusalem and says, go to Jerusalem. He's sending them to all these cities. Go there, raid their temples, get their booty so we can pay. When he gets to Jerusalem, the people in Jerusalem rebel. They stop him from coming into the temple. In fact, he's there with an army, and they stop the army from coming into the temple. And they turn him around and send him back. And his treasurer guy goes back home and ends up poisoning Seleucus IV, so he's no longer king. You guys, I'm not even doing this justice. When I was studying this, I'm like, holy smokes. I mean, they got dates and details and how it happened and where he was when he got poisoned and how he died and it's just crazy, all this stuff going on over these hundreds of years. But the guy who rises to power after Antiochus IV is killed is Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes is somebody we're probably going to have to talk about next week because we're already done. And I thought we'd get a whole lot farther than this. I thought we'd get all the way to like verse 35. We didn't even get halfway there, did we? Wow. We'll start next week. Anybody got any crazy questions about what we just talked about?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
What station does that come in on?
It's just crazy. It's crazy stuff. It's going to continue. It's going to slow down a little when we get to Antiochus Epiphanes, but it continues. So next week we'll have to pick up where we left off. So let's pray. God, we love you. Thank you for your word. I thank you for showing us that you are a God that knows the end from the beginning. A God that from ancient of days, you told us how it was all going to end. And you're proving it right here in the book of Daniel. You're laying out to Daniel all the events over the next several hundred years and even times after us, even to the Antichrist here in the 11th chapter of Daniel. And I thank you, God, for showing us that you are God. Your promises are true. Your word is true. It come true exactly the way you said it was going to. I pray, God, that you'd help us as we study it to know that you are God and that we can count on your word. Help us to understand it. Help us as we put it together. I pray you'd watch over us this week. I pray again for your protection over your church here on this hill. Help us to follow you with all of our heart. Time is short. Help us to be your light in the darkness. And I pray it in your name. Amen. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.